March 1945. A small town along the western edge of the Rhine. The winter cold has not yet released its grip. Rubble lines the streets. Windows are boarded or broken. Smoke still hangs in the air, thin and gray. Children stand near a doorway that no longer has a door. They are quiet. Their coats are worn. Their shoes do not match. For months, they have watched German soldiers pass through. Mud-caked boots, torn sleeves, rifles dark with rust and oil. Then a different sound approaches. Engines run evenly. Not strained. Not coughing. American trucks roll into view. Soldiers step down. Their uniforms are intact. Their helmets are clean. Rifles hang straight on polished slings. Packs are full, properly secured. Even in the dust of a ruined town, their equipment looks maintained, almost new. The children stare, not at faces, at details, the shine of metal, the dryness of canvas, the absence of desperation. No words are exchanged. None are needed. In a place where scarcity has become normal, order itself feels foreign. And in that moment, long before any flag is raised or document signed, the war's outcome becomes visible, quietly, unmistakably, through the condition of the men now standing in the street. The reason for that contrast begins far beyond this town, in decisions made years earlier. By the time American soldiers reached the Rhine in early 1945, the Second World War in Europe had already been decided in all but name. Germany was still fighting. Orders were still issued. Units still moved on paper. But the structure that had once supported the Wehrmacht's reach across the continent was collapsing from the inside out. 6 years earlier, in September 1939, Germany had entered the war with an army built for speed, coordination, and short campaigns. Blitzkrieg relied on momentum. Armored thrusts moved faster than supply lines were expected to stretch. Equipment was used hard, replaced quickly, and maintained just enough to keep pace with the advance. In Poland, then in France, this system appeared unstoppable. The war seemed designed to be won before endurance ever became a factor. But the war did not end in 1940. By June 1941, Germany expanded the conflict eastward with Operation Barbarossa. The scale changed immediately. Distances grew vast. Roads disappeared. Weather became an enemy. Equipment that had performed well on European highways failed in mud, dust, and extreme cold. The German logistical system, never designed for prolonged multi-front war, was strained beyond its assumptions. As the Eastern Front absorbed men and material at an unprecedented rate, German industry struggled to keep pace. Unlike the United States, Germany did not fully mobilize its economy for total war until late. Civilian production continued. Factories competed for labor. Standardization lagged. Different models of tanks, trucks, and weapons required different parts. Repairs became slower. Maintenance suffered. By 1943, the effects were visible even to civilians. German soldiers returning on leave no longer wore crisp uniforms. Boots were patched. Belts were cracked. Rifles showed signs of years of continuous use. Replacement equipment, when issued, often came from captured stocks or simplified late-war designs that traded durability for speed of production. At the same time, Allied bombing began to reshape daily life inside Germany. Strategic air raids targeted industrial centers, rail yards, and oil facilities. Even when factories survived, transportation networks did not. Trains ran irregularly. Fuel was rationed. Spare parts sat in warehouses that could no longer be reached. A functioning supply system became fragmented. Children growing up in Germany during these years absorbed these realities without explanation. They saw soldiers sleeping in school buildings. They watched columns march past with fewer vehicles and more carts. They learned, quietly, to read the condition of uniforms the way earlier generations read rank insignia. On the other side of the Atlantic, a very different process was unfolding. After December 1941, the United States committed to a war of production as much as combat. American planners understood that the conflict would not be decided by brilliance alone, but by sustainment. Factories were reorganized for volume. Designs were simplified. Interchangeable parts became a priority. Equipment was built not only to fight, but to endure transport, misuse, and rapid repair. By 1943, American industrial output surpassed that of all Axis powers combined. Trucks, uniforms, boots, rifles, radios, everything was produced with consistency. A soldier in France carried the same standardized gear as a soldier training in Texas. Supply depots were stocked in depth. Replacement flowed forward continuously. This difference in philosophy would soon walk directly into German towns, streets, and homes. The children who would later stare at clean American equipment were not reacting to novelty alone. They were reacting to the visible arrival of a system that had not been exhausted. And that system had been moving steadily eastward for months. By the autumn of 1944, the Western Front had crossed a threshold that German civilians could sense even without maps or reports. After the Allied landings in Normandy on June 6, the war moved quickly. First across the hedgerows of northern France, then through shattered towns, across rivers, and toward Germany's western border. For civilians, the direction of movement mattered. The front was no longer distant. It was approaching home. American ground forces advancing through France and Belgium carried the visible marks of a military at full capacity. Convoys moved in ordered columns. Vehicles bore fresh paint and clear unit markings. Canvas covers were intact. Tires were uniform. Even under combat conditions, equipment appeared standardized and cared for. Maintenance units followed closely behind combat troops, repairing and replacing material with practiced routine. In contrast, German forces opposing them showed the accumulated wear of years. By late 1944, the Wehrmacht was no longer a single coherent force but a patchwork. Veteran units fought alongside newly formed Volksgrenadier divisions. Older men and teenage boys filled ranks once occupied by professionals. Weapons varied widely. Some carried modern assault rifles. Others used outdated bolt-action rifles or foreign arms taken from occupied countries. Uniform shortages were acute. Soldiers wore mismatched coats. Winter clothing was insufficient. Footwear, in particular, deteriorated rapidly. Civilians, especially children, noticed this immediately. Shoes told stories. A soldier with cracked soles and wrapped feet looked different from one stepping confidently in factory-new boots. As American forces entered the German border regions in late 1944, places like Aachen, the Saar, and the Palatinate, children watched cautiously from doorways and cellars. Years of propaganda had prepared them to fear Allied soldiers. Posters and lessons depicted Americans as crude, chaotic, and violent. Yet the first impressions did not match the warnings. American soldiers arrived with equipment that looked untouched by the long war. Rifles were clean. Webbing was intact. Packs were full. Helmets showed scratches but not neglect. Vehicles idled smoothly. Even small details stood out. Neatly rolled blankets, identical mess kits, standardized rations packed in sealed containers. For German children accustomed to scarcity, this abundance was shocking. Food had been rationed for years. Soap was limited. Clothing was reused until it failed. Repairs were constant. In this context, the sight of soldiers who appeared well-fed, well-equipped, and orderly created a quiet cognitive rupture. This was not merely about material superiority. It was about contrast. German soldiers, once symbols of authority and strength, now looked exhausted and reduced. American soldiers, portrayed as inferior by official messaging, appeared calm and prepared. They did not scavenge. They did not beg for supplies. Their system followed them forward. The shock registered most strongly in moments of stillness. When firing stopped. When vehicles parked in village squares. When soldiers cleaned weapons or adjusted gear without urgency. Children watched these small actions closely. They noticed that nothing seemed improvised. By early 1945, as American units crossed the Rhine and pushed deeper into Germany, this contrast became unavoidable. The war was no longer a story told by adults or radios. It stood in the street, tangible and undeniable. And with that realization, attention shifted from movement to meaning, toward what this visible imbalance said about how the war had truly been fought. Angle 1. The child's eye noticing what adults could not say. Children experienced the collapse of the German war effort without the language to describe it, but not without perception. They noticed patterns long before explanations formed. In towns and villages along the advancing front, children watched silently from windows, behind fences, from the edges of roads. They were not looking for strategy. They were looking for differences. They saw American soldiers unloading trucks with ease. Boxes were opened. Supplies were distributed. Nothing appeared scarce. Nothing was argued over. German soldiers, when present, behaved differently, checking equipment repeatedly, conserving movement, avoiding waste. To a child, these behaviors did not look like discipline. They looked like anxiety. German adults often avoided discussion. Fear, loyalty, and exhaustion shaped what could be spoken aloud. Children filled that silence with observation. They compared boots. They compared coats. They noticed which soldiers carried spare gloves and which wrapped hands in cloth. They noticed that American soldiers cleaned weapons even when there was no immediate threat, and that German soldiers often lacked the tools to do the same. This quiet awareness mattered. Children were not judging ideology. They were judging stability. The American presence felt organized, predictable, repeating itself each day. German authority, once absolute, now appeared fragile and temporary. The shock was not loud. It did not arrive with panic. It settled slowly, through repetition. Convoy today, another tomorrow. The same equipment, the same confidence, the same routines. For children raised on stories of inevitable victory, this consistency was unsettling. It contradicted what they had been taught without directly confronting it. The world no longer aligned with instruction. And in that gap between teaching and reality, the war took on a new shape, one that could not be ignored. Angle 2. The equipment itself, order as a visible weapon. American military equipment did more than function. Communicated. Standardization was its most striking feature. Rifles matched. Packs matched. Vehicles followed the same design language across units. To trained eyes, this signaled logistical mastery. To civilians, especially children, it simply looked deliberate. American uniforms were designed for replacement and repair. Components were modular. If a strap broke, it could be replaced. If a boot wore out, another pair existed. The system assumed wear and prepared for it. This philosophy extended to everything visible on the soldier's body. German equipment by late war reflected a different reality. Shortages forced improvisation. Factories bombed or repurposed. Materials substituted. Designs simplified. The result was visual inconsistency. No two soldiers looked entirely alike. For children, this difference was striking. American soldiers looked like parts of a larger machine. German soldiers looked individual, exposed, unsupported. Even weapons told the story. American rifles were maintained regularly, supported by cleaning kits and spare parts. German soldiers sometimes lacked oil or replacement springs. Maintenance became optional when resources disappeared. Order became a form of power. Clean equipment suggested that tomorrow was planned for. Dirty, mismatched gear suggested survival without expectation. This was not about aesthetics. It was about signals. The American army appeared confident enough to care for details. That confidence was visible to anyone watching. And as these details accumulated in memory, they set the stage for a deeper understanding, one shaped not just by what was seen, but by how it was sustained. Angle 3. Logistics made visible why American order did not fade. The most powerful systems in war are often invisible. Supply chains, repair depots, transport schedules, none of these were designed to be seen by civilians. Yet by 1944 and 1945, American logistics had become impossible to hide. They manifested daily, in motion, in repetition, and in calm. American units arriving in German towns did not exhaust themselves upon arrival. Vehicles did not stop permanently due to breakdown. Equipment did not slowly degrade into disrepair. Instead, trucks came and went. Fuel arrived. Parts were replaced. Soldiers rotated through rest and duty with predictable rhythm. Children noticed this without understanding its source. They saw that American soldiers did not guard every object nervously. Supplies were not treated as irreplaceable. A broken crate was discarded without ceremony. Another took its place. This behavior signaled abundance. Behind this visible order stood an immense system stretching back across the Atlantic. American industrial output, untouched by bombing, produced more than frontline units could immediately consume. Ships arrived continuously. Rail networks were repaired rapidly. Depots expanded instead of shrinking. German logistics, by contrast, had collapsed under sustained pressure. Allied bombing targeted factories, rail yards, and fuel facilities. Even when equipment existed, it often could not reach the front. Deliveries became unpredictable. Repairs were delayed indefinitely. The effect of this imbalance was psychological. American order did not weaken with time. It reinforced itself. Each day looked like the last. Each convoy suggested another would follow. For children observing from sidewalks and fields, this continuity mattered more than any single event. It suggested permanence. It suggested that the Americans were not improvising. They were executing a plan that had been prepared long in advance. And that realization began to extend beyond equipment, toward the people who carried it. Angle 4. The enemy soldier, what German troops understood first. German soldiers understood the significance of American order before civilians did. They had watched their own supply lines thin. They had counted ammunition. They had waited for fuel that never arrived. When they encountered American units with clean equipment and steady routines, they recognized the implication immediately. After-action reports from late 1944 describe a growing awareness of disparity. American units could disengage and return at full strength. German units often could not. Losses were permanent. Replacements were inexperienced or non-existent. German soldiers also noted American maintenance discipline. Weapons were cleaned daily. Vehicles were serviced even after short movements. This was not vanity. It was preparation for longevity. For German troops, the shock was not emotional, it was mathematical. They calculated how long they could hold, how long before weapons failed, how long before exhaustion outweighed duty. Children, watching the same scenes, absorbed a simpler truth. The German soldiers no longer looked in control. They looked cautious, tired, temporary. When German units withdrew, they often did so quietly, without ceremony. American units replaced them with visible confidence. Flags changed. Checkpoints changed. But the most noticeable change was behavior. The American soldiers did not rush. They unpacked. They organized. They cleaned. And in that calm transition, the meaning of defeat became visible, not as chaos, but as replacement. Angle 5. Leadership and doctrine, cleanliness as an instruction. American military doctrine emphasized preservation. Equipment was meant to last. Soldiers were meant to return. Maintenance was not secondary, it was a core responsibility. Orders reflected this. Time was allocated for cleaning. Supplies were allocated for repair. This doctrine was enforced through leadership at every level. Officers inspected equipment regularly. Non-commissioned officers corrected lapses immediately. Cleanliness was treated as readiness, not appearance. German doctrine had once valued similar discipline. But by late war, it had been overwhelmed by necessity. Orders emphasized holding ground, completing missions, enduring shortages. Maintenance became conditional. The difference in leadership philosophy manifested on the ground. American soldiers were allowed to pause, to care for their tools, to prepare for tomorrow. German soldiers were often pushed forward with diminishing means. Children noticed which soldiers looked rested, which ones laughed, which ones sat comfortably while cleaning rifles instead of clutching them anxiously. Leadership decisions, made far from the streets where children stood, had filtered down into posture, movement, and confidence. The results were visible in every interaction. And as these impressions accumulated, they shaped something deeper than fear or admiration. Angle 6. The psychological shift when order replaced belief. Belief is fragile. It survives on reinforcement. For years, German children had been taught that strength meant sacrifice, endurance, and loyalty. But belief requires evidence. And by 1945, the evidence visible on the streets no longer supported the lesson. American order contradicted collapse. Clean equipment contradicted desperation. Predictable routines contradicted chaos. This did not immediately inspire affection or trust. It inspired confusion, a quiet reevaluation. Children began to understand that power could look calm instead of loud. The war, once defined by slogans and parades, now revealed itself through logistics and maintenance, through boots without holes, through weapons that worked every day. The shock was not humiliation. It was clarity, and that clarity prepared the ground for the moment when observation would turn into acceptance, when the outcome of the war would no longer be debated, only endured. That moment was approaching. The turning point did not arrive with a single explosion, a decisive charge, or a dramatic announcement. It arrived through repetition, through days that looked the same, through a quiet certainty settling into streets, homes, and occupied towns across Germany in early 1945. By February, the Western Front no longer moved in bursts. It advanced steadily. American units crossed rivers that had once been declared impassable. They repaired bridges under fire and used them within hours. Supply columns followed immediately behind combat troops, closing the gap between fighting and stability. For civilians, and especially children, this was new. In earlier years of the war, movement meant danger. Armies passed through, fought, and vanished. What followed was scarcity. What followed was waiting. Now, movement meant continuity. American divisions did not dissolve after combat. They reorganized. They cleaned weapons. They redistributed supplies. They prepared to move again. Towns that had been battlegrounds became transit points. Roads reopened. Schedules returned. This was the moment when the war's outcome became visible without explanation. Children standing near roads and checkpoints watched convoys roll through day after day. Trucks marked with white stars. Vehicles repaired quickly, sometimes overnight. Soldiers who looked the same from one week to the next, clean, rested, methodical. German resistance still existed. Fighting was still fierce in places. But its character had changed. It no longer shaped the rhythm of events. It interrupted them briefly, then faded. The collapse of German logistics accelerated this shift. Fuel shortages immobilized units. Rail lines destroyed by bombing could not be restored quickly. Ammunition arrived late or not at all. Commanders improvised, but improvisation could not replace capacity. American forces, by contrast, operated on schedule. The children did not know the names of operations, veritable grenade, plunder. They did not track corps movements or army group boundaries. What they saw were patterns. American soldiers arrived. They stayed organized. They moved on. German soldiers arrived. They looked exhausted. They departed quietly or did not depart at all. In this contrast lay the true climax of the war on the ground. Not a moment of noise, but a realization. The system that had sustained Germany's war effort was no longer functioning. While the enemy's system was not merely intact, it was accelerating. And as winter turned toward spring, that acceleration carried the war toward a conclusion that could no longer be postponed. By March 1945, the imbalance had hardened into certainty. The Rhine, long imagined as Germany's final natural barrier, no longer functioned as a wall. It became a line crossed in multiple places by multiple armies, almost simultaneously. When American forces captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen on March 7, 1945, intact and usable, it was not treated as a miracle. It was treated as an opportunity. Within hours, infantry crossed. Within days, armor followed. Engineers worked without pause. Anti-aircraft guns were positioned. Supply trucks queued across the span. The bridge, under constant German attack, remained in use long enough to change the strategic geometry of the war. What followed was not chaos, but flow. Once across the Rhine, American units advanced with a tempo German forces could not match. Roads filled with movement. Fuel trucks, ambulances, field kitchens, repair vehicles, each appeared in sequence, each on time. Combat units pushed forward knowing they would not outrun their supplies. German formations fractured under this pressure. Orders arrived late. Communications failed. Units surrendered not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked options. Without fuel, without ammunition, without replacement equipment, resistance became symbolic. For civilians, the change was immediate and unmistakable. American soldiers now appeared in areas once considered unreachable. They arrived clean, equipped, and prepared to stay. Checkpoints were established. Warehouses were secured. Patrols were regular. Children watched soldiers wash in streams, shave in the mornings, eat hot meals from organized field kitchens. These were small details. They carried enormous meaning. The German military had once projected inevitability. Now, inevitability belonged to someone else. The condition of American equipment reinforced this message. Vehicles bore marks of long use, but they functioned. Weapons were maintained. Boots were replaced. Even after weeks of movement, uniforms remained serviceable. The war was being carried by a system that planned beyond the next fight. By April, organized German resistance in the West collapsed rapidly. Entire towns surrendered without combat. White flags appeared before artillery was brought forward. Civilians waited not in panic, but in quiet anticipation. This was the decisive threshold. Not the fall of a city or the defeat of a field army, but the disappearance of uncertainty. From this point forward, the war no longer asked if it would end, only how and how soon. And with that certainty established, the consequences, human, material, and psychological, began to unfold across a shattered continent.